Okay, well, a very good afternoon to you all, and a big thank you for your invitation to come and speak to you today. It's a great pleasure to be back in Seoul and to be talking about OECD work. I'd just like a word of congratulations, incidentally, to the organizers of the conference. I think what you've managed to put together is a really very interesting program, and it's already shaping up to fulfill its promise, so well done on that. This is now very much a change of tack, because I'm going to take you now into a somewhat different world. I'm taking you now into a couple of economic sectors which, in our view, are actually very promising vehicles when it comes to the actual practice, if you like, of implementing measures and exploiting opportunities presented by the creative economy. But before I do that, let me just spend a few moments talking about the work of the International Futures Programme at the OECD, so you have a better idea of where I'm coming from. So essentially what we do at the OECD is we're sort of a radar screen for the organization. And what we try to do is use sort of we use horizon scanning to try to identify some of the emerging issues. And when we think that we've identified interesting projects, then we try to build projects around them and start to explore the potential for developing new work at the OECD. And as you'll see from both of the things that I'm presenting, very often these turn out to be very multidisciplinary, very cross-cutting areas. So once we've piloted these projects, we tend to then try to sort of incubate them, and then once they reach a level of maturity, we move them into other parts of the organization where there's a better and more permanent structure to take care of them. And this will give you an idea of just how diverse and varied our work has been over the years. You can see we've just about done everything here, from societal issues to energy, financial issues, risk management, which played a very important part in our program of work, migration. Some of the space work here I'll be talking about, infrastructure, and work we did on biotechnology in its form of the bioeconomy, looking ahead to 2030. But what I wanted to talk to you about today are two areas of current interest to us in the International Futures Programme. And the first of these is work on space technologies that we have been doing. And this is mainly based on work of the OECD Space Forum, which we established 5 or 6 years ago, and in which we brought together a good number of the leading space agencies around the world, basically to look at the statistics of the base of the sector, which is not terribly well developed, and which was in need of some more careful analysis, notably in terms of the products and services that the space sector can produce. But we were also very intrigued, I think, by the idea that maybe we could help the space sector raise its own visibility and make clearer to the broader public, and in particular to policymakers, just how useful space technologies can be in responding to global challenges like climate change, like food shortages, like risk management. And the second area which I'll be talking about is what we're calling the future of the ocean economy. And in fact, it involves many of the sectors which are now beginning to emerge and to be particularly important, we think, for the next 20 or 30 years, and which will in many instances be important drivers of the creative economy. So let me just start first of all giving you an idea of what you might call the global landscape of the space sector. Now if you just go back 50 years, and think about the number of nations, spacefaring nations that were around at that time. There were very few indeed. And it's really quite remarkable that over the last 50 years, the numbers of countries involved in space has increased quite phenomenally. And in fact, this is actually out of date, because if you if you count the number of countries who've now notched up their first independent launch to orbit, it's around about 11. And in fact, since then, of course, Korea itself, in January of this year, became the 13th country to launch a rocket from its own soil. So things are really happening there in the space sector in terms of the involvement of different countries. And that's demonstrated here by this chart here, which gives you an idea of just how widespread this has become, and of how the number of countries involved in operational satellite launching has become. So really quite an impressive picture compared with what we had a few decades ago. Now, what's important here really is that it's not just the well-established spacefaring nations who make up the picture these days. And what we've seen in recent years is an upsurge, particularly in the spending on space in the BRIC countries. And you can see there just how very important China has become, for example, how very important and already the Russian Federation was and is now perhaps increasingly so. India, which has now emerged on the scene, Brazil even, and a bit further down there, even the likes of Indonesia and Turkey. And this is just one of the examples you find of the increases in spending on space budgets that has happened in recent years. India has really excelled itself in that sense, moving from virtually nothing in the late 1970s to a huge upturn in spending by 2012 in its latest five-year budget plan. And this is the key. Why do we talk about these things, of course? And that is because we consider that space activities are indeed highly skill and knowledge intensive, first of all, and that secondly, they make a very significant contribution to economic growth, to innovation, to creativity, and more widely, in respect of the economy, to improved productivity. I'll just take you through some examples and figures of that right now. This gives you, first of all, an idea of how we can sort of look at the potential benefits of investment in space programs. There are, of course, temporary impacts that we have there, and these arise when you're setting up a space center, for example, when you start to get benefits in transport infrastructure and so on in the region where the space center has been set up. But that's not really the important thing about investing in space. We're after the enduring impacts that you get from investing in space. We have four categories of that here. One is the way in which space really generates new commercial activities. And you don't have to look very far for that sort of thing. So many people these days driving around with a sat-nav in their plane, for example. This is really a clear case of where global positioning has really led to an extraordinary market development further downstream. It's also important in terms of the way that space infrastructure and space products increase the productivity gains that the economy more generally can reap. And some examples of that, for example, are the development of precision farming in developed countries and in developing countries too. The way that global positioning and Earth observation can help fisheries, and indeed is an important element of building an intelligent transport system. And equally, of course, the very fact that you have to manufacture satellites, you have to manufacture your launches, this in itself generates quite a bit of revenue for the economy. There's also a more, and this is the fourth element here, there's also a more difficult to quantify element of space benefits, and this is where the space tools at policymakers' disposal actually help avoid costs socially. And I'm thinking there, in terms of weather forecasting, thinking there in terms of the way that space tools can be used to improve risk management on the ground in times of natural disasters. So if you start further up in the chain, looking at space manufacturing revenues here, you can see that they've been up and down, but basically over the last 9 or 10 years, they've held up pretty well, not just in the United States, but also with the rest of the world. They're moving increasingly onto that terrain. And so, as you would expect, the launch industry revenues have been increasing equally, but there again, the spread has been across numerous parts of the world, as they've all sort of begun to join in offering their services for launching satellites and reaping the benefits from that. But perhaps one of the most important areas, really, that I'd like to talk about is research and development in space. And what you have here are a couple of charts showing these civilian space programs share in government budget appropriations and outlays for R&D. So the thing to look for there, first of all, in the first chart, is the thick red line in the middle there. That is the OECD total. And what you see there is that actually the share of government R&D spending has been keeping up quite well over basically since the 1980s, around about 10%. The US, of course, a good deal higher than that, and some of the countries clustering around the 5 to 6%. Go down to the bottom here, and what is there quite interesting, I think, is we see Korea on the far right there, around 4%. So space spending on R&D, around about 4% of total government budget appropriations. Now, interesting, that is somewhat lower. In fact, it's a good deal lower, first of all, than the OECD average, which is rather surprising because, as we saw previously from one of the slides that was shown to us, R&D spending in Korea as a whole is actually above the OECD average. So there's an interesting dislocation there somewhere. So it's these enabling technologies of satellite infrastructure, and these enabling technologies are basically Earth observation, it's SATCOM, it's global positioning, timing and navigation. And what they do is present a really formidable, very effective platform for innovation in downstream space applications. And I just listed some of those things here for you. One of their most powerful uses, of course, is in meteorology, but also in observing the environment. Very helpful, of course, in financial transactions, entertainment, traffic management. When it comes around to precision farming, for example, and urbanization, their uses in land use planning, very important. Exploration, not least, of course, in the oceans, very important. Monitoring treaties, exclusion zones and the like. Disaster management, I've already mentioned, and also precision farming. But also, and these are areas that are being increasingly used by developing countries. This is distance education and telehealth and the likes. Very important for the likes, for example, of India. So what happens, of course, as the numbers of applications multiply, so does the dependence of our modern-day economy grow on those space applications. And this is one of the odd things about space technologies, that they're practically invisible to us. We're hardly aware of what is going on, and yet they play such a crucial and critical role in what we do every day. And these are just some of the examples here, starting from air traffic control and going through to measuring climate change and climate variability, offering early warning, for example, on extreme weather events, a very important area. Ocean surveillance, which I'll come back to in a moment, and indeed early detection of near-Earth objects, becoming a very important for us. We've only had a few months ago an event in Russia which caused considerable damage and a number of fatalities. So a rising dependence, basically, of society on some of these technologies. So what sort of market opportunities then do these technologies open up for us? Well, these are just some ballpark figures that I've put together for you just to give you an idea of the size of the global markets we're talking about. So telecommunications at the moment, somewhere between 11 and 15 billion. Satellite broadcasting, by far the largest of the markets, at, somewhere between 65 and 72 billion. The geopositioning market, that's a growing segment of the market worldwide, and that's precisely the kind of infrastructure that is required for the multiplication of the products, such as the car navigation systems, which are now so common. But also even satellite Earth observation, where the market is valued at almost $1 billion US. It's probably larger than that, but there are a lot of confidentiality issues involved there, which make measurement, of course, a little rather difficult. And there are some, important ancillary markets there, not least space insurance, because launchers and satellites are generally insured against loss, not least from collision with debris while in orbit. So what this does is, this is a chart we put together to give an idea of the way that the government spending, institutional spending up front on the space sector can in fact generate very substantial direct and indirect economic benefits. So we worked out that the 175 to 200 billion that was invested in space programs worldwide over a 10-year period from 1996 through to 2005 contributed to something like double that, or maybe even treble that, as far as we can tell, in revenues for the entire value chain of the space sector. And you can see that in some of the studies that have been put together by the likes of the UK, by Norway, by Belgium, by Denmark. And what they've done is they've looked at the amount of money that they have been putting into the European Space Agency, and then measuring the amount of revenue generated by the work that has flown back from the European Space Agency to their own space economy. So what they've managed to identify there is a very important multiplier. And in Norway, it's estimated to be around somewhere between 4 and 5, which is quite considerable. Denmark around about 4, Belgium around about 4, in the UK it's somewhere between 3 and 4. So measured like that, investment upfront, institutional investment in the space sector, producing very considerable benefits for the economy more broadly. And that's expected to continue, and you can see here some of the projections that have been put together by a number of companies and also by the European Commission, to give you a sense of both in terms of Earth observation and in communications and positioning of the very significant economic benefits that are expected over the next 10 to 20 years. So here's a really important markets opening up as you move further and further downstream in the value creation chain of the space industry. So some quick reflections here on policy implications and challenges. I've mentioned this already. First of all, a much greater recognition required really of the key role that space can play in the creative economy as a motor of growth, as a motor of innovation and knowledge-based employment creation. But it's also important, it's not just about launches, it's also about the importance of setting up a really robust and technically sophisticated space structure with all these enabling technologies that I just mentioned. Because these are the basis, in fact, for the growth in innovation in space applications and for the creation of those new markets that I was talking about. Importantly also, space is not something that is self-contained. Space really up there has to be joined up with other technologies so that it can actually leverage those benefits. This is really a very important point to make, and it means that space is one of the areas where cross-cutting collaboration across different technologies is extremely important in order to leverage those benefits. There's also the question, and we've seen this, Cam brought this question up before. This is really important. We need to ensure that we have a good stock and flow of really highly qualified scientists, engineers and technicians. And this is an area we'll probably come back to in the discussion on the panel. And that is, of course, that space, just like many other sectors, such as nuclear, is facing an aging problem. and the workforce, of course, is aging quite rapidly, and there is concern that we're not going to be able to actually continue to replace those missing skills as the years go by. That will, of course, mean a very considerable weakening of the lifeblood of the sector. And so what this really boils down to is maybe there is some value to be attached here to developing the national space strategy. Well, firstly, some countries do not have a space strategy, but those that do have a space strategy really would spend their time, I think, quite usefully trying to develop that framework into a much more coherent framework for identifying some of those domestic and worldwide opportunities that are evolving and which will eventually serve to foster the longer-term development of the space economy. So there are some ideas on the challenges and issues and opportunities that we have in the space sector. I'll leave that up because it's rather a nice picture, because this actually allows us to transition from space to oceans. And of course, as you know, the only way you can really effectively monitor the ocean is basically from up there in the sky. And this is, of course, one of the unique advantages of space technologies. They do play a role here, we'll be seeing about that, but what I want to do is move from up there to down here and talk to you just for a moment about what we're calling the space economy. And what we're trying to do, I mean, the work we're building up is really not just about the future of the ocean economy itself, it's especially about those industries which are proving to be particularly promising and not yet properly off the ground, not yet perhaps fully developed, or at least moving into a new dimension of activity. And basically the storyline goes something like this, that the ocean there has huge opportunities for us. We cannot do without it in facing some of the big challenges that we're looking at over the next 20, 30 years. We have an extra 2 billion people to feed and to provide livelihoods for in the coming 20 years. You know, we have to manage our natural resources much more sustainably than we're actually doing. There's a big drive out there, of course, to reduce our carbon footprint and to ensure that we are finding more renewable sources of energy. But you know, we can't really grow that ocean economy unless we really deal with the oceans in a very responsible way, because quite simply they're already under very considerable stress. So what we're doing here is a forward look at emerging ocean-based sectors, and here are some of the sectors, just for curiosity: offshore wind, offshore oil and gas, ocean energy, marine biotech, aquaculture, seabed mining, ocean monitoring, surveillance and control. These are some of the areas which we think are set to flourish in the next 20 years if they're given the headway to do so. And what we'll be doing in the project is focusing on their contributions to growth and employment, looking at some of the risks and uncertainties involved, but in particular looking at what is needed in terms of science and technological breakthroughs. This is where we come to the whole creativity issue, because we will not be able to develop those sectors and at the same time look after our oceans in a responsible way unless we can come up with some really appropriate solutions for doing that. So oceans under stress, and you're familiar with many of these, I'm sure: pollution from human activity and the pressures, of course, coming from coastline populations, rising levels of acidity in the oceans, rising sea levels, of course, because of the warming of the planet. So the problem here is, you know, how do you actually draw on the ocean's economic potential without making things worse than they already are? Now, one of those solutions, of course, is an improved management and governance of the oceans, the way that we actually administer them, the way that we run them. But very importantly, science, technology and innovation hold the key to success in this area. I'm going to give you just 3 or 4 examples of what I mean by that. I'm going to start first of all with fish, which are an extremely important food source for many, many millions, in fact billions of people. What has been happening in recent years, and is likely to continue to happen over the next 20 years or so, is that capture fisheries are simply plateauing. Stocks have been exploited to such an extent in many parts of the world that production simply cannot increase anymore. Now, fortunately, what has been happening is that aquaculture has been moving up ever more steadily, and so that by now more than 50% of human consumption of fish is actually from aquaculture. But as I just said, in the next 20-30 years we're expecting a further 2 billion people on the planet. So how do we go about that? Well, it means that we're going to have to scale up aquaculture. But the problem, of course, with aquaculture is that coastal areas are very limited, and we're going to have to start developing new species, new developments in ocean techniques, and so on. This is very S&T intensive, and one of the areas that needs to be developed quite intensely. Offshore oil and gas, these things have been moving increasingly into much deeper water, into much more hostile environments. And this is a real problem for the operators of those rigs. It's also a huge challenge in terms of the science and technology that's going to have to go into it. This is completely new science. Drilling down 2,000, 3,000 meters of water and then a further 2,000 meters into the ground is really an enormous challenge, but that's where it's going to have to go, and the potential rewards for that, of course, are very considerable. And a similar story can be told about the gas, and in particular the liquid natural gas that has been produced around the world. But that again needs much more attention from technology and from science, because we need new methods for processing those finds. Offshore wind energy, again, we're expecting in Europe at least a very considerable increase in the amount of installed capacity that we have there. And that in turn, and that's the important point about this, and that is that certainly for Europe, the increase in capacity on offshore wind energy will be very important for raising the amount of employment involved in the industry, and in particular the high skill end of that. That's not just a matter for Europe, as I've been discovering, but also for Korea, which is starting to build very well on a lot of its shipbuilding and heavy engineering capacity, and is now really upping the investment in that respect with some very interesting ventures off the southwest coast. That's the last couple of slides here. The Arctic is becoming an extremely important area for us all. As the ice cap recedes, what are we going to see happening are new shipping routes opening up. We're going to see new fishing grounds being exploited, tourist locations developing, oil and gas and other minerals becoming exploitable. This is really going to become an area of intense activity. Now, who's going to monitor that? Who's going to survey that? We're going to have a very crowded Arctic. It's already happening in other parts of the world where we have very crowded seas and so on. Well, much of that is going to have to be conducted, of course, by maritime surveillance, control and monitoring. And there again, as I was mentioning before in the space slide, the European maritime security market is already pretty large, and worldwide it's developing very fast, something like 11 billion euros by the time we get to 2018. So it's really some very big opportunities here for remote sensing. So my final slide basically here on the policy implications and challenges. Quite simply that, when you're looking at the creative economy, there is a very important place for emerging ocean industries there. Really huge potential for science and technological advancement. Also, there's probably a need really to bring more focus onto ocean-based economic activities. These activities are all extremely interdependent, very often in crowded coastal areas. Need better planning, better governance of those things, of course, but a good deal more investment in science and technology. So let's take a really good look at some of the opportunities and emerging risks that we face there. Let's try to measure these things a good deal better than we're already doing at the moment. And then let's put our minds, in fact, to developing an ocean strategy, or even a national ocean policy. In many cases, this is only happening on a very limited basis worldwide, so that we can come up with a more coherent framework for really reinforcing this economic and scientific and innovative endeavour that we have there in the source of and in the form of the ocean economy. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.